A plan for the future. ISIS may have lost its strongholds in Syria and Iraq, but a former member tells CNN the terror group has been planning the next phase of its war. The mystery deepens. The Pentagon gives some information about that ambush on US soldiers in Niger, but many questions remain unanswered. And my immediate task, that's what Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe calls North Korea after an election set him to stay in power for some time to come. Thanks for your company, everyone. I'm Michael Holmes. Amra's off today. Welcome to CNN Today. Well, ISIS's ambitious plan to set up an empire across parts of Iraq and Syria and further afield is now obviously falling apart. Over the weekend, it lost control of Syria's biggest oil field to US-backed Kurdish and Arab forces. The field is in the province of Deir ez-Zor. Right now, the US coalition is working on expelling ISIS fighters holed up in a nearby neighborhood. This coming days after ISIS was defeated in its self-declared capital of Raqqa and months after it lost control of Mosul. CNN senior international correspondent Arwa Damon joins us now from the border town of Kobani in northern Syria with the very latest. Bring us up to date, Arwa. I know you've been out and about and reporting.
Hi, Michael. And when you do list all of those significant ISIS losses, one can perhaps not be blamed for making the assumption that perhaps ISIS is in fact on its way to being defeated. But that is not necessarily the case when it comes to dealing with a complex entity such as ISIS is. We did speak to two men who were middle operatives within the ISIS ranks who had some pretty interesting insight as to what it is the group's next steps may be.
ISIS's survival is not tied to the fate of its crumbling caliphate. It planned for this day. ISIS did calculate that one day they will be finished. The Bahraini man says, his voice calm and steady. His name is Omar. He says he was in charge of ideological training at ISIS military camps in Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa. He tells us they did not put a lot of money into the battles they fought. The weapons they used were the weapons of the enemy. The money went elsewhere, Omar says. Even during times of austerity, there was always a calculation for the future. No one knows exactly how much ISIS is worth now. In 2014, the group was thought to have a total of $1.5 to $2 billion. It was making $1 million a day from oil fields, more than enough for its regular expenses. ISIS has distributed its revenues overseas for the next phase of its war. Isam is an ISIS member from Morocco who oversaw the border crossings between Turkey and ISIS territory. He tells us that ISIS would train and dispatch members to set up companies, which then acted as facilitators, but also behaved as regular businesses. ISIS may no longer physically control swaths of Syria and Iraq, but it thrives underground. And it is widely assumed that the ISIS leadership, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his top lieutenants, are in the border areas between Syria and Iraq, familiar territory. The first stage of the ISIS insurgency, back in 2010, was called aggressive hibernation, making money, building networks in the deserts and cities of Iraq. In many ways, ISIS is going back to that strategy, waiting for the next opportunity. It's an ideology that exploits and feeds off of deep-seated grievances, fosters a thirst for revenge. They will spring up somewhere else, Omar says, if you don't know how to fight them ideologically. ISIS plots for the long game. Its leaders are fond of saying that it's not ruling Mosul and Raqqa that counts. It's the will to fight. And ISIS will once again simply bide its time.
And Michael, both of those men are currently being held by the Syrian Democratic Forces after they handed themselves over some 3 to 4 weeks ago, with Omar, who you heard from there, further telling us that, as we have been seeing, ISIS has already been expanding into areas of North Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond.
I'm curious why they told you this information about, ISIS's final moves, and, and how do they spend their time there?
No, they're currently being held. Both of them do have families who are being kept at a separate refugee camp. They say that they don't have blood on their own hands per se. Both of them, to a certain degree, claim to have thought that life under ISIS was going to be one thing, only to arrive within the borders of the caliphate and see that it was, in fact, something else. Both of them claim to be disillusioned with the direction that ISIS took, with some of the actions that it carried out on the ground. Interestingly, Armando was also telling us that in the last weeks, ISIS would struggle to try to get new recruits. In fact, ISIS would go around and begin to attempt to at least forcibly conscript young men ages about 20 to 30, he was saying, into their own fighting ranks. But both of them were warning that they did not necessarily believe that that brutal ISIS ideology, their capability to continue to reach out their tentacles through social media, through other means, through preaching in various mosques overseas, was going to be coming to an end anytime soon. Both of them, to a certain degree, said that, yes, they did regret having joined ISIS, but at the same time, there were certain elements that still appeal to them about the ISIS way of life, in terms of wanting to live under this so-called pure version of Islam. But it's a very complex situation, I think, even for individuals such as these, because they too are having to come to terms with what it is that they have been through, and they too are going to somehow, at least at some stage, have to be either repatriated or reabsorbed into society.
Yeah, and so many others like them. Just a fascinating insight. Great reporting, as always, Awa Damon there on the ground in Syria for us. Well, ISIS also lost ground in western Syria over the weekend in the town of Al-Qaryatan. Now, this just days before, though, 20 days before, in fact, it was taken back by Syrian government forces. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says ISIS militants executed at least 128 locals. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is urging Kurds and the Iraqi government to keep their focus on the war against ISIS. On Monday, Tillerson met with the Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi during a surprise visit to Baghdad. He urged both sides to try to resolve the conflict. Now, tensions have flared since Iraqi forces took the city of Kirkuk from Kurdish control a week ago, and following a Kurdish referendum last month calling for independence. We've learned more details, meanwhile, about that deadly ambush in Niger that killed 4 U.S. soldiers, but key questions remain unanswered. The chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff briefed reporters just a few hours ago and said the families of the fallen do deserve more information as the investigation pushes forward. Our Manu Raju now with more.
Tonight, the Pentagon revealing new details about the ambush in Niger that killed 4 U.S. soldiers.
And there's a perception that the Department of Defense has not been forthcoming.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff revealing that U.S. forces were on a reconnaissance mission and on their way back to their operating base in Niger when the firefight began. But they waited 1 hour to call for support.
Important to note that when they didn't ask for support for that first hour, my judgment would be that unit thought they could handle the situation without additional support. And so, well, we'll find out in the investigation exactly why it took an hour for them to call.
It took French fighter jets another hour to arrive on the scene, which was 2 hours after the ambush began. Dunford making clear many questions still remain.
Did the mission of U.S. forces change during the operation? Did our forces have adequate intelligence, equipment, and training? Was our pre-mission assessment of the threat in the area accurate? How did U.S. forces become separated during the engagement, specifically Sergeant Johnson? And why did it take time to find and recover Sergeant Johnson?
The comments come amid growing tension with Capitol Hill, where top lawmakers from both parties accused the administration of failing to disclose how 4 service members were killed in Niger.
Americans should know what's going on in Nigeria. And one of the fights I'm having right now with the administration is that Armed Services Committee is not getting enough information. And they deserve it because we represent their families, too.
The questions have swirled since the October 4th raid that left 4 American soldiers dead, killed in an ambush by up to 50 ISIS-aligned militants near the Niger-Mali border. There's been conflicting information about what the American troops were doing at the time of the ambush and how they came under fire from the ISIS insurgency.
Obviously, there's something that they even don't know at this moment.
Another key question, why was the body of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson found nearly a mile away from the scene of the ambush? It's one of the many questions that Sergeant Johnson's widow still has today.
I don't know how he got killed, where he got killed, or anything. I don't know that part. They never told me, and that's what I've been trying to find out since day one, since October 4th.
According to the Pentagon, there are approximately 800 U.S. troops in Niger. Most are helping construct a drone base in Agadez, while others are supporting embassy operations in the capital, Niamey. The military says a fraction of these troops are special operations forces, advising and assisting the Nigerian military. The Pentagon says it's kept Congress regularly informed, pointing to a letter Trump sent Hill leaders in June, saying there were then 945 troops in Niger and Cameroon performing counterterrorism duties.
I didn't know there was 1,000 troops in Niger. John McCain is right to tell the military, because this is an endless war without boundaries, no limitation on time and geography. You got to tell us more.
Some say it's the responsibility of members of Congress to know what is happening in the region.
I recoiled a little bit at that, truthfully. They're conducting 5 named operations, which I'm sure the Senate Armed Services Committee should know about.
Now, on Thursday of this week, the Senate Armed Services Committee is holding a closed briefing with members of that committee to understand exactly what happened here. But one question that still remains is exactly how the body of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson emerged a mile away from that central scene of that ambush. That's a question that Dunford was not able to answer today. But what Dunford did say was that if there are questions from members of Congress, then I need to, quote, double my efforts to get the information out. Michael?
Now, thanks to you, Manu Raju there. Now, a top U.S. lawmaker urging unity over the death of Army Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. In a Monday interview, Senate Republican John McCain said there should be no fighting over a man who died serving his country. He was also asked about comments he made on C-SPAN about those who served and those who did not serve in the Vietnam War.
One aspect of the conflict, by the way, that I will never, ever countenance is that we drafted the lowest income level of America, and the highest income level found a doctor that would say that they had a bone spur. That is wrong. That is wrong.
Now, McCain never mentioned the U.S. president by name, but Mr. Trump's deferments are widely known. McCain went on to say he does not, in fact, think of Mr. Trump as a draft dodger. So, what happens in Syria and Iraq after ISIS loses ground? I want to talk about that and other things with CNN military analyst Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He's joining us via Skype. He's also the former U.S. Commanding General for Europe and the 7th Army. And when we were together in Iraq, you were running the north of the country and doing a great job. There's a lot going on, Mark. I do want to briefly ask you about Niger. What questions would you like answered when it comes to the death of these servicemen? Does it strike you odd they waited an hour to call it in or call for help? It seems odd.
You want to get more information on all of this, Michael. And to answer your question about what do I want to know, I want to see what comes out of the investigation. It will be interesting. Having started these kinds of investigations on combat casualties, combat deaths, accidental deaths, I know that the investigating officer, who I understand is a one-star general out of AFRICOM, will be looking for a bunch of things. He'll not only be looking at intelligence, but he'll be looking at how they executed the command and control of the operation, what their mission was, how they coordinated with the alliance, how they coordinated with their partners in Niger. So there are going to be a lot of interesting results that come out of that. And I think General Dunford was spot on today when he said hey, we've got to wait for that investigation to be complete.
Right.
What he gave today was an interim briefing to the press, and I love you guys that are journalists, Michael, but you know the deal. The most important information is what the general officers have to get in terms of what happened in the event, so they can, first of all, inform the families. Secondly, make sure it doesn't happen again, and then they'll give the rest of the information to the press.
And then so often, particularly in combat, the first reports are the incorrect ones. I wanted to get your expertise on what is unfolding in northern Iraq, also across the border in Syria. Now, in northern Iraq, of course, you used to command coalition forces during the war. There's a lot of tension, clearly, between the Kurds in northern Iraq and Baghdad, central government. You dealt with these sorts of tensions back in 2008. So what are the risks here? Could it lead to open conflict?
There is that potential. And I think the independence referendum that the Barzanis have asked for a few weeks ago and is causing some tension with the Kurds and the Arabs in the northern part of the country will be critical. And I think it is an interesting time for Prime Minister al-Abadi to ensure he communicates with the Kurdish leaders, Masoud Barzani, Nursultan Barzani, to ensure that they have the right approach to what happens in the future. Now, the Kurds, as you well know, are really striving for independence of the Kurdish state, the 3 Kurdish provinces, and then some. And I use that phrase to talk about what's going on in Kirkuk. Kirkuk province is technically not a part of the Kurdish region, but the Kurds see that as a part of their territory. So there is tension between what belongs to the Kurds and what belongs to the Arab country of Iraq as they've conducted this independent referendum. That's going to complicate things even more.
I remember standing with a Kurdish commander outside of Mosul and said, how far are you guys going to go? And he said, this is where we stop here. This is our border now. So they did take more turf than was traditionally. The thing is, this goes back a long, long time. As you know well, the Kurds are never going to trust the intentions of Baghdad. Baghdad's never going to entrust the intentions of the Kurds. What would a workable compromise look like?
Yeah, that's the question of the day. This is sort of, I hate to use this analogy, but it's somewhat like Jerusalem, isn't it? What belongs to which sect of society? They are going to take a look at Kirkuk because that is really the heart of Kurdistan, even though it's in an Arab province. The Kurds want Kirkuk. They want part of Kirkuk province as well as part of Diyala province and Nineveh province in the north. And that's going to be the contention. This is also the area where most of the oil is found. Isn't that interesting? So the economic strength of northern Iraq comes from this area that is part of the contentious geography. So I think, you know, again, the Kurds have seen this as an opportunity. They have defeated ISIS. They have been asking for independence for a very long time, or at least leaning that way. And I think, unfortunately, the timing is horrible. Just as Prime Minister al-Abadi has brought about a form of nationalism in Iraq, now he needs to communicate with the Kurds exactly how they need to pull this country back together. It comes at a terrible time, but I think it's what the Kurds are looking for.
Yeah, I wanted to squeeze this in too, as we saw in Iraq and Libya, and perhaps we might see with U.S. involvement in Yemen. It's always, you know, what we didn't plan for that gets the U.S. and the world in trouble. What hasn't the U.S. planned for when it comes to northern Iraq, now Raqqa, and surrounding areas in Syria?
Well, you know, what we didn't plan for, which has occurred within the last year plus, is the Russian involvement. You know, you had Nick Payton Walsh doing a story earlier today about how close the aircraft were coming as they circled over the city of Dar es-Zar and also over Raqqa. So you have both Russian and Syrian Russian and Syrian governmental planes flying over some of that territory, and you also have U.S. and coalition planes flying over part of the territory. That's sporty right there in itself, but it's not half as contentious as it's going to be when these forces come together on the ground. We're yet to see what's going to happen there, and right now we don't have an end state. We've been helping the Syrian Free Forces and the Kurds in that part of Syria to regain part of their territory, but pretty soon we're going to be bumping up against the Syrian forces and the Russians, and we have not coordinated what the end state looks like. So as complicated as Iraq is, boy, Syria is an exponential level above that.
The whole area is. I'm told I've got time for one more. Just speak to the need for what comes later when you're talking about Mosul, when you're talking about Raqqa, the need to rebuild, to give people a place to come home to give them governance, and also to deal with the fundamentals that make the ideology appealing, and that relates to central government.
Right, and there's two different stories. You have one in Iraq, and you saw this well in 2008 when we were fighting in Mosul, and it was time to rehabilitate the city and bring new construction in there after the major fight against al-Qaeda. The central government did not come through with funding and direction, and that caused it to drift back into the hands of ISIS. So unless we see that central government involvement in helping the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, to rebuild and come to become the mother of two springs as it once was again, you're going to see a recurring thing, as Arwa Damon pointed out just a few minutes ago, where ISIS is going to reemerge, or some form of ISIS.
Right.
Now, Syria is a whole different story. I can't tell you what's going to happen there as long as you still have the Assad government in power.
And I'm in trouble with the producer because it was so interesting. I just kept on going and going and going. Mark Hertling, Lieutenant General, retired. Thank you so much. Good to see you, my friend.
Always a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
All right. Now, imminent, serious and critical. Japan increases the alarm over the threat looming across the sea after Shinzo Abe's big election win. We'll have that and a lot more when we come back. Welcome back. The defense ministers of the US, South Korea and Japan are talking about how to deal with North Korea and its nuclear program. Some awkward handshakes and laughs, as you can see there at the summit for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, in the Philippines, but also a very pointed warning from Japan.
North Korea is steadfastly improving its nuclear and missile capabilities. The threat caused by North Korea has grown to a serious and critical level. Therefore, we are being forced to take a response at a different level.
Now, that alert comes a day after the Japanese Prime Minister soared to victory in snap elections. He took a gamble that paid off big. Shinzo Abe's win due in large part to fears over North Korea. The US President called to congratulate him earlier ahead of his planned visit to Tokyo.
President Trump will visit next month on the 5th. I received a phone call today, and we agreed to spend time during his visit discussing the situation with North Korea and cooperating closely over it.
Mr. Trump, of course, goes to Asia next month. Meanwhile, the 21st storm of the season in Asia turned out to be a deadly one. Typhoon Lan hitting land on Monday in Japan, bringing heavy winds, rains, flooding and mudslides. There's some new images from the area, new information on the death toll that Tom Sate has been digging up. Tom, bring us up to date. It was quite a storm.
It really was, and this is the second storm to affect Japan this season that actually made it to super typhoon strength. Now, it wasn't that strong when it made landfall, thank goodness, but this was an interesting storm. I'm going to pause it here because we had an event that we typically don't see with all landfalling tropical systems. Notice all the rain to the north across Japan. This is called a predecessor rain event. It doesn't happen much, but when there's a cold front moving into an area, it seems to like to pull the moisture out ahead of the storm. So the ground was saturated, the rivers and streams were rising, and then you have all that rainfall on the weekend, you toss in a passing cyclone, and then we've got problems. In fact, let me go ahead and just show you some of the video. We were talking about the snap elections. Turnout was a little lower because, of course, this making landfall on that day, even some election sites postponing their vote, but the rivers are swollen. There's no doubt about it. The heavy amounts of rain before it moved in and during, creating over 500 millimeters of rain in several locations. That's not only October records for heaviest rainfall for the month of October, but all-time records. The surf was a problem. The winds caused problems as well, knocking out power. A lot of construction sites, of course, had scaffold fall. That took a life in Kyushu. The death toll went from 2 to 7, according to the Japan Times. And, of course, with this landslide, you could see, I mean, 7 is a lot. It's 7 too many, but it could have been much higher. Thank goodness the authorities actually evacuated 240,000 that were under mandatory evacuations, but 2.1 million had some sort of evacuation. So that kept the death toll down. Here are the two, Noro and Lan, that affected Japan this season, the only two to ever make it to super typhoon status. Typically, we have 3 by now. No one's complaining. The number of typhoons are down. But notice, we're about where we should be for the Pacific. Now, this is is a year-long process. There really isn't a season that it ends. It gets slower during some months, but in the Atlantic, the season is only from June through November. So the number of named storms drops in half. But look at how above average the activity has been. Doubled the number of hurricanes in the Atlantic, and we've had 6 major hurricanes, 4 of those making landfall. What's significant about the Atlantic season is that 10 consecutive named storms became a hurricane. Back to the Pacific, we are watching another development. It was a tropical depression, now a tropical storm. It will be named soon. And unfortunately, Michael, it looks like this one's moving up toward Okinawa, which they can handle this, and then sliding again across Japan. Hopefully staying off the coast. We've got several days to tweak this. We're not going to have to report this every day, but by the end of the week, we'll give you an update because it could reach Category 2 status, and that's the last thing that you want. Again, a lot of damage. We're just getting the video in, of course, that we shared with you, but let's give them a few days break so they can clean up and get ready for the next one, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Just keep on coming. Tom, good to see you, my friend. Tom Sater there. Well, a former Fox News host accused of sexual harassment says it has been horrible for him and his family. Bill O'Reilly lashing out after revelations of a $32 million settlement he made with a former colleague. Welcome back, everyone, to CNN Today. I'm Michael Holmes. Time to update you now on the top stories. The chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff says the families of 4 fallen soldiers deserve more information on that deadly ambush in Niger. At a news conference, Marine General Joseph Dunford detailed a timeline of what happened the day of the attack, saying the troops were ambushed by 50 enemy fighters on their way back to the base. The North Korean threat high on the agenda at the regional summit in the Philippines, the ASEAN summit. Now, Japan's defense minister meeting with his American and South Korean counterparts and warning the threat has reached a critical and imminent level. The Pentagon chief stressing the need to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. The U.S. Secretary of State, meanwhile, is in Iraq hoping to calm tensions between Baghdad and the Kurds and keep the focus on fighting ISIS. Rex Tillerson met with Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi on Monday during a surprise visit. Iraqi forces this past week, of course, seized Kurdish-controlled areas following some clashes. Well, the former Fox News host, Bill O'Reilly, does not dispute a $30 million settlement made with a colleague over allegations of sexual harassment. But in a new interview, he's portraying himself somewhat as the victim. O'Reilly calls the New York Times article about the settlement another smear campaign against him. On Monday, the paper released new audio from an interview with him.
We have physical proof that this is bull. Okay? So, it's on you if you want to destroy my children further. All right? Because it's all crap. Why don't you be human beings once? This is horrible. It's horrible what I went through. Horrible what my family went through. This is crap. And you know it. It's politically and financially motivated. And we can prove it.
CNN senior media correspondent Brian Stelter joining me now from New York. This is a visceral reaction from O'Reilly. He claims the details are wrong. He says he can't talk about it. It's wrong, but he can't say why.
Yeah, he'd rather attack the media than talk about his own conduct. Where have I heard that before, Michael? Of course, I'm thinking about Bill O'Reilly's friend, President Trump. But in both cases, you see these men wanting to attack the messenger rather than deal with the problem right in front of them. Bill O'Reilly really did pay $32 million. That is confirmed by my sources as well as by the New York Times original scoop. We've seen the affidavit that Lise Will signed, essentially promising not to sue. So we may never know for sure why O'Reilly was willing to pay her that much money, but it's always going to be a mystery, and it's always going to be something that is shocking. It's jaw-dropping. I mean, normally you hear about settlements in these cases that might cost $50,000 or $100,000 or maybe $1 million, but $32 million, that is out of this world.
Yeah, and it's his money, right? He paid up.
That's right.
Why would you pay $32 million for something you didn't do?
You know, Gretchen Carlson, who sued Roger Ailes last year, the head of Fox News, said nobody innocent pays $32 million. Nobody innocent does that. That was her visceral reaction to this. Now, O'Reilly says he's stuck here. He's not able to comment because of the terms of the agreement. But it seems to me that he's been promising all year long to provide evidence that really this is a plot to take him down, and he hasn't actually provided that evidence. Right. I know it's a convenient answer for him, but there's not evidence for it.
It's easy to say I can't say anything because of the agreement, but it's wrong. Megyn Kelly, former Fox anchor, also saying, disputing O'Reilly and saying, because he said that nobody ever complained, she said she complained, and she said Fox wasn't a friendly environment for those who reported harassment.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons why she ended up leaving Fox and going over to NBC. The big picture here, the big issue here, I think, is what Rupert Murdoch and his sons James and Lachlan have to contend with. The idea that these sexual misconduct scandals continue to haunt Fox News. Even 15 months after Roger Ailes was ousted, even after Bill O'Reilly was forced out, these revelations continue to resurface. They continue to be appalling to most of the folks that hear about them. It reminds me in some ways of the phone hacking scandal from Britain from a number of years ago. The Murdochs had a very hard time getting past that, and now they're saddled by these sexual misconduct scandals in the United States.
And hey, business is business. The Murdochs are trying to buy a satellite network called Sky, which is huge. A lot of our viewers know it well. And regulators are already looking closely at the Murdochs as being fit and proper owners. Well, how's this going to play into that?
This is yet another reason why it's going to be difficult to win approval for the deal. Already, British regulators have looked at those American scandals and been concerned. Now, here's yet another shocking revelation, this time the $32 million figure, which is really, it's sort of having this ripple effect in the United States of people asking, what could have possibly caused this kind of payment? So it's just yet another piece of information for the regulators to consider.
Murdochs will not be pleased. Brian Stelter, as always, a pleasure. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Coming up here on the program, a Palestinian film festival cancels a screening of one movie amid protests over the director's previous work in Israel. The details ahead. You're watching CNN Today. Welcome back. A Palestinian actor is now expressing his anger after the film he starred in was pulled from a Palestinian festival before it was screened. The action coming amid a boycott campaign over the director's previous work. Our Ian Lee with the details.
The insult depicts a complex story of Palestinians living in Lebanon where a perceived slight leads to a courtroom drama.
I believe that it is the first noble character in the Arab cinema for the Palestinian.
Excitement built for the film screening, but the curtain didn't rise, adding injury to insult.
The governor of Ramallah decided to stop screening the movie. I don't get it. I'm very angry. I don't get it. It's shameful for me.
The film faced criticism for one reason. Lebanese director Ziad Doueri previously filmed in Tel Aviv. That's a red line for many Palestinians, even though his latest film starring al-Basha was shot entirely in Lebanon. BDS, or Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, led the call for the movie to be postponed. The movement, in its words, works to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians and pressure Israel to comply with international law. BDS admits al-Basha's film doesn't fall under their guidelines for boycotting. It's the director that they are targeting for dealing in Israel.
Making something that's inherently abnormal, like the occupation, like a master-slave relationship, to appear deceptively normal. And that's what this filmmaker is doing.
A group of Palestinians took their anger to social media, demanding the movie be banned, some even posting death threats. Ramallah officials say they were forced to cancel the screening for safety. The festival's director wanted to judge himself if al-Basha deserved the international accolades.
Unfortunately, now there is censorship that is being borne, whether for religious or political or any other reasons. We had it this year. It was never before. Every Palestinian citizen should have the right to watch a film and decide whether it's good or not.
Ian Lee, CNN, Ramallah.
Well, if you need to get away from it all here on Earth, how about heading off to space? Why not? Richard Branson is hoping his space travel company, Virgin Galactic, will be ready to take people to space very soon. Listen to what he told our Poppy Harlow.
I think 16 weeks from now we should be in space, and maybe 6 months from now I should be in space.
Just before my unborn son is going to be born. This is really soon.
There's a challenge. And then, you know, by the end of next year, hopefully we'll have our license to start taking people up.
This is the first time Branson has put a timeline on space travel since a deadly test flight back in 2014. And you can find out more about Virgin Galactic and see more of his interview with Poppy on CNN.com. And finally, over in Paris, there was a light moment for the French president, or perhaps we should call it a moment of relief. We're going to show you Emmanuel Macron's dog, Nemo. There he is, standing between the two gents. He was famously adopted from a shelter this year. Now, keep your eyes on the top right there, behind the man there, the fireplace. You can see it, yes. Nemo had some trouble finding the bathroom. Up goes the leg. He made a surprise appearance during a meeting of junior ministers to prove that when nature calls, there is no saying non to oui, oui. I did just say that, didn't I? You can check out more of our stories on our Facebook page. Go to facebook.com, call it up, come on, facebook.com/CNN Today. Catch up on the best stories and interviews from our show. Don't forget to like us. They're going to call it up. I can hear them talking about it. It's there. Comment on our stories, facebook.com/CNN Today. If they didn't find it, thanks for watching. I'm Michael Holmes, at Home CNN, at Amra CNN, because she's watching and she'll be mad if I don't say that. World Sport coming up.
This one looks empty.